If you're a songwriter looking for some inspiration, these 10 chord progressions I'm about to show you have been used in literally millions of popular songs over the last 50 years or so. And we're going to go through these 10, first of all starting with the easier ones, the ones that really form the foundations of contemporary Western music, before moving on to some really interesting and less common chord sequences that will help you break out of some of those traditional patterns. So stick around for those. Throughout this video, I'm going to bring these chord sequences to life, show you how to play them in different keys, and show you some great examples of famous and very popular songs that use these chord sequences in some really creative ways. Before we dive in, let's quickly look at the number system we'll be using to talk about these chord progressions. And the number system is really important because it allows us to learn these chord progressions in any key. So the chords for any major key are arranged as follows. We have the 1 major, the 2 minor, the 3 minor, the 4 major, the 5 major, the 6 minor, and the 7 diminished. So those 7 chords make up what's called a diatonic system. That means all of those chords belong in the same key. But some of these chord progressions actually borrow sounds from outside of the key, and we'll talk about how you can incorporate that into your songwriting a little later on. Number 1, the 1-4-5. The 1-4-5 is the backbone of Western music. We really can't talk about chord progressions without talking about the 1-4-5 first. These 3 chords form the foundations of folk, blues, rock and roll, and so many other genres. And as songwriters, we want to get really comfortable with these 3 chords, learn them in different keys, and look at all the different variations that are possible. So here's the 1-4-5 in C. But we can do it in E. Do it in G. That groove I was just starting to play, you could hear that coming from so many different songs, including Twist and Shout by the Beatles. Now, the power of any chord sequence really lies in its variations. And with this chord sequence, we can obviously change the 1-4-5 to a 1-5-4. If we play a little punk rock kind of groove, we get All the Small Things by Blink-182. So a really important thing to note as we move through the rest of these chord sequences is that the chords themselves are just one factor in songwriting. All the other variables, including the key we're in, the tempo, the time feel, the genre, how long we hold each chord, these are really important considerations and will allow you to take some very standard chord progressions and reinvent them in new and interesting ways. Number 2, 1-5-6-4. Straight away, we hear Let It Be by Paul McCartney. And you'll notice that the 1, the 4, and the 5 are present again in this chord sequence, but we have the addition of the A minor, the relative minor chord, the 6 chord. And the introduction of a minor chord really provides some lovely contrast for the ear in relation to the other major chords we're hearing around it. If we take this chord progression up to E, we get Under the Bridge by Red Hot Chili Peppers. Number 3, 1-6-4-5. This is a great sound because the 1 and the 6 chord are connected. They're like siblings. That's why they're called relative major and minor. Every major chord has a relative minor and vice versa. So here we get the major falling to its relative, and then the 4 and the 5 bring us back home. If we go to the key of A and hold each chord for 2 bars, you'll hear the sound of Stand By Me, that timeless classic by Benny King. Now going back to the key of C, there's a little bonus move I want to show you, which is a really popular move with guitarists. And that is to put an extra little chord in between the C and the A minor. The chord we're going to put in there is a G over B. You hear this move used in the beautiful Alleluia by Leonard Cohen. And with that chord progression, we actually go back and forth between the C and the A minor a couple of times before moving on to the 4 and the 5. So it's a variation of the 1, 6, 4, 5, but you'll hear it in action. I've created a free PDF with all 10 of these chord progressions mapped out, so if you're interested in that, check out the link below. Number 4, 4, 3, 2, 1. The previous 3 chord progressions have started on the 1 chord, and starting on the 1 chord really helps establish the tonal center. The 1 chord is our home chord. It's stable. All the other chords in the diatonic sequence are away chords. They're not at home. And so as songwriters, when we're putting together combinations of chords, we're looking for opportunities to take the listener away from home and then bring them back home in a really satisfying way. Starting on the 4 chord means we're starting away from home. We're starting in a place that is less stable. And that automatically creates some interest for the ear. There's a great variation to this chord progression that I want to talk about though, and that comes from the song Wichita Lineman, written by Jimmy Webb and made famous by Glenn Campbell. The song is set in the key of F, and it starts off by playing that F chord and really establishing that tonal center in our ear. But then it moves to the 4 chord when the lyrics come in. The 4 chord B flat, the A minor 3 chord, the G minor 2 chord, and then instead of falling down to the F like we expect it to, it goes to D minor. And why that's such a great move is because D minor is the relative minor of F major. So they're really substitutes for each other, except the D minor obviously gives us that slightly darker sound as opposed to the very stable and major tonality of the home chord F. So let's go back to the key of C for a second and look at how we can use both of these options to create an interesting chord sequence. So we're going to start by going 4, 3, 2, 1. If we now go around again and imagine this is like a verse section in the song that we're writing, the second time round we're going to use the variation that we hear in Wichita Lineman, and we're going to go to the 6 chord instead of the 1. It's a really lovely variation and so effective because it creates really this 8 chord sequence instead of just a 4 chord sequence cycling round. Number 5, the 2, 5, 1. Now that we're looking at chord progressions that don't start on the 1, we have to talk about the 2-5-1. This chord sequence is so important in our music history and really forms the foundations of traditional jazz. And the reason it's such a great and enduring sound is because it again starts away from home and takes us on a little journey before arriving back home in a really satisfying way. And even though it's a very old form, you still hear it in contemporary songwriting. For example, Sunday Morning by Maroon 5. A little bonus with this chord progression, if you're looking to experiment with some slightly more advanced chord concepts, the 2-5-1 really lends itself to extensions and to 7th chords being added into the mix because it comes from that world of jazz and we're so used to hearing 2-5-1s played with those little extensions. And what that might look like is instead of playing a D minor, we might play a D minor 7. Instead of playing a G major, we'll play a G dominant 7. And then we'll play a C major 7 instead of a C triad. If we want to add the extensions, we can start playing around with those 9s, 11s, and 13s. So what if we went D minor 9, G13, C major 7? Great sound. Another little bonus, which I just can't help throwing in because I think it's such a great sound, is the addition of the major 6. And this is the first time really that we're going to hear a chord that's non-diatonic, a chord that's outside of the key. But what that would sound like is 2, 5, 1, 6. And that 6 major has such a great pull back to the 2 chord that it allows us to really turn this 2-5-1, which is a 3-chord sequence, into a 4-chord sequence which cycles around beautifully. And because we're expecting to hear the A chord as a minor, when it arrives as a major chord, it creates this little element of surprise for the ear. This is the power of non-diatonic chords. This is why songwriters love pulling sounds from outside of the key and inserting them into their chord progressions. It really creates a little moment of delight for the listener. And there's a few chord sequences coming up that use this idea. But first, number 6, 6-4-1. Like the 2-5-1, this little 3-chord sequence packs so much punch because again, we're starting away from home and arriving there in a very satisfying way. And what I love about this chord sequence is experimenting with chord duration, how long I hold each of these 3 chords. If we hold the 6th chord at the beginning for twice as long as the others, it sounds really great. You hear the 5 chord being used a lot in Western harmony, pulling us back to the 1. But before the 5-1 became really popular, the 4-1 was actually a very popular move. John Mayer uses this sequence beautifully in his song Slow Dancing in a Burning Room, played in the key of E, which means we're starting on the C sharp minor as the 6th chord. Number 7, 1, 2 major, 4, 5. We're going back to a chord progression that starts on the 1, but the joy of this progression really is in this major 2 chord, and you hear it used to great effect in Bob Dylan's I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. Like we heard earlier when the major 6 popped up instead of the minor 6, here we're expecting the minor 2 and we get the major 2. And again, we get this little moment of delight and surprise. The borrowed chord coming from outside of the key really serves to change up what is a very predictable chord progression in some ways and gives us that little moment, that little momentum push with the major 2 inserted in the 2nd position. The fact that they're all major chords also keeps it quite bright and light, and again, that might be perfect for the song that you're writing. Number 8, 1, flat 7, 4. This is another great 3-chord sequence that you hear used in so much music, and for a lot of people, it was really cemented in popular culture by Lynyrd Skynyrd's Sweet Home Alabama. And the introduction of the flat 7 chord really takes us away from what we would think of as the Ionian mode or the major scale and takes us more towards the Mixolydian mode, which is essentially the major scale with the flat 7. And this is important because a lot of blues and rock and funk music lean on this flat 7 sound. And so when we use the flat 7 chord in our songs, we're often infusing a little bit of that funkiness, a little bit of that bluesiness into the progression. Courtney Barnett does it beautifully with her song Avant-Gardener, played in the key of G. You also hear it in Pearl Jam's classic Elderly Woman Behind a Counter. this time in the key of D, and notice how little time the progression spends on the one chord. It really spends most of its time going back and forth between the flat 7 and the 4. Number 9, 4, 1, major 3, 6. In the song One Headlight by the Wallflowers, we hear the verses structured around this progression, and the guitar really drives the song forward by cycling around these 4 chords. And the great thing about this progression for me is that the major third is again unexpected, but because it's positioned just before the A minor, it has this beautiful effect of again pulling us to the A minor in a more powerful way. And the reason for that is that the E chord actually has a 5-1 relationship with the A minor. And so when we turn the E minor into an E major, the pull effect is amplified. And that means that the A minor lands with even more impact than it would have had we used the E minor. And number 10, 1, major 3, 4, 4 minor. In this progression, we hear not 1, but 2 borrowed chords. Chords that have come from outside of the key to create that little element of surprise. And while we hear both of these chords used in lots of different songs, for me, the greatest example of this progression is Creep by Radiohead. That minor 4 chord can be used on its own, and we hear it sometimes being used to pull us back to the 1. But where it seems really, really effective is when we start by playing the major 4 and then transition to the minor 4. The move between those 2 chords really creates a special kind of effect and delays the resolution back to that home chord. So there are 10 chord progressions that you should really get to know as a songwriter. And if you experiment with them in different keys, at different tempos, with different time feels, you'll be amazed at how many songs you end up writing with them.